The Laura Kempton case, 42 years of silence. Introduction, a case that wouldn't stay cold. There are cases that detectives carry with them long after they've moved on to other assignments. Cases that haunt the quiet moments, that resurface in dreams, that refuse to settle into the comfortable numbness of filed paperwork and closed chapters. The murder of Laura Kempton was one of those cases. For 42 years, her killer walked free. For 42 years, her family waited for answers that seemed like they might never come. For 42 years, investigators in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, refused to give up on a young woman whose life was stolen on an autumn morning in 1981. This is the story of how modern science, old-fashioned determination, and the relentless march of technology finally brought justice to a case that had gone cold before most of today's investigators were even born. When we talk about cold cases, we're really talking about promises. Promises made to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Promises made to families who deserve to know what happened and why. Promises made to communities that need to believe justice is still possible, even when years turn into decades and hope begins to feel like a luxury no one can afford anymore. The Laura Kempton case represents all of that and more. It's a story about the evolution of forensic science, about how DNA technology that didn't exist in 1981 would eventually identify a killer who had been dead for nearly 2 decades by the time he was finally named. It's a story about a police department that never stopped working the case, even when leads dried up and witnesses disappeared and the evidence seemed to point nowhere at all. But more than anything else, this is Laura's story. A 23-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her, studying to become a hairdresser, working at local shops to make ends meet, living her life in the coastal New Hampshire city she'd made her home. She was described by everyone who knew her as an outgoing free spirit, with a big personality and a love for new wave fashion. She was the kind of person who lit up a room, who made friends easily, who had dreams and plans and a future that should have stretched out for decades ahead of her. Instead, that future was cut brutally short on September 28, 1981, in a crime so violent and senseless that it shocked a community and left investigators scrambling for answers that wouldn't come for more than 4 decades. Part 1, September 27th to 28th, 1981. The last day. September 27th, 1981, started like any other Sunday for Laura Kempton. The 23-year-old was settling into life in Portsmouth, a historic coastal city in New Hampshire, known more for its colonial architecture and maritime heritage than for violent crime. Portsmouth, in 1981, was a city in transition, still holding on to its working-class roots while beginning to attract artists and young professionals drawn to its walkable downtown and proximity to the ocean. Laura had found her place in this community. She was enrolled at Portsmouth Beauty School, pursuing her dream of becoming a hairdresser. Those who knew her said she had a natural gift for connecting with people, for making anyone feel comfortable in her presence. The beauty school wasn't just a career path for Laura, it was a calling. She understood that hairdressing was about more than cutting and styling hair. It was about the conversations that happened in the salon chair, about making people feel good about themselves, about the small moments of human connection that make up a life. To support herself while going to school, Laura worked at Macro Polo, a gift store on Market Street in downtown Portsmouth. She'd just started the job but her co-workers were already charmed by her energy and enthusiasm. She also worked at Karen's Ice Cream Parlor, another local establishment where her big personality made her a favorite among customers. These weren't glamorous jobs, but Laura didn't complain. She was building a life, one shift at a time, one hairdressing technique mastered at a time, one day closer to the future she was working toward. That Sunday evening, Laura spent time socializing with friends. She was actively dating, enjoying the freedom of being young and single in a small city where there was always something happening, always someone to meet, always a reason to go out and experience life. The night before, she'd had a date with a man she'd been seeing casually. He'd spent the night, and they'd parted ways that morning with plans to see each other again soon. It was all perfectly normal, the kind of casual relationship many young people navigate as they figure out what they want from life and love. As the evening of September 27th turned into the early morning hours of September 28th, Laura made her way back to her apartment. She lived at 20 Chapel Street in downtown Portsmouth, in a ground-floor apartment in an older building typical of the area. These were the kinds of buildings that had been converted from larger single-family homes into multiple units with high ceilings and period details that gave them character, even if the apartments themselves were modest. Witnesses would later tell police that they saw Laura entering her apartment alone in those early morning hours. She was returning from her evening out, ready to call it a night and rest up before another week of classes and work shifts began. She had no way of knowing that someone had been inside her apartment, waiting for her to return. She had no way of knowing that she would never see another sunrise. The discovery. The morning of September 28, 1981, dawned bright and clear over Portsmouth. It was a Monday, and the city was coming to life with the usual rhythms of the work week beginning. Office workers grabbed coffee on their way to their desks. Shop owners opened their doors. Students headed to classes. It was an ordinary autumn morning in every way, except for what was about to be discovered at 20 Chapel Street. Portsmouth Police Officer Ron Grivois had a routine task that morning. He needed to serve Laura Kempton with a court summons for unpaid parking meter violations. It was the kind of mundane police work that fills up most days on the job: paperwork, summonses, traffic violations, nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest his morning was about to take a horrifying turn. When Officer Grivois arrived at 20 Chapel Street sometime during the morning hours, he immediately noticed something wrong. One of the panels in the wooden door leading to Laura's ground floor apartment was missing. The door itself was closed, but that missing panel created an opening that shouldn't have been there. Based on what investigators would later determine, someone had broken that panel, then reached through the opening to unlock the door from the inside. Looking through the broken panel, Officer Grivois could see into the apartment. What he saw made his blood run cold. A body was lying on the floor. He could see legs, visible and bound with some kind of cord. There was blood spattered on the far wall of the apartment. Officer Grivois immediately called for backup and secured the scene. Within minutes, more officers arrived, along with detectives and crime scene technicians. What they found inside Laura Kempton's apartment would be seared into their memories for the rest of their careers. The crime scene. The apartment was in disarray. There were clear signs of a struggle in the living room and bedroom area. Furniture had been moved or knocked over. Personal belongings were scattered. This hadn't been a quick, clean killing. This had been violent and chaotic, a scene that spoke of terror and desperation. Laura's body lay on the floor, and the scene around her told a grim story. Her legs were bound with an electric blanket cord. A kitchen phone cord was wrapped around her neck and shoulder area. There was a large amount of blood on the rug beneath her head, and investigators noted a pattern of bloodstains on the wall at an upward angle, which could suggest the mechanics of the attack, someone striking her repeatedly while she was already on the ground. Near her body, investigators found a glass bottle. Based on the injuries and the blood evidence, this bottle appeared to be the murder weapon. Some sources would later describe it specifically as a wine bottle. Whatever its original purpose, it had been used with devastating effect to inflict massive trauma to Laura's head. Also near the body, crime scene technicians found a cigarette butt. This seemed significant. Laura wasn't a smoker, and the positioning of the cigarette butt suggested it had been left by someone else. Based on where it was found and the blood evidence in the apartment, investigators theorized that the killer had spent time in the apartment after the murder, possibly trying to clean up or simply catching his breath after the violence. The cigarette butt was carefully collected and preserved as evidence. Other physical evidence was meticulously documented and gathered. Investigators collected fingerprints from various surfaces throughout the apartment. They took photographs from every angle, documenting the crime scene in exhaustive detail. They collected samples of blood, hair, and fiber evidence. In 1981, DNA profiling wasn't yet widely used in criminal investigations, but investigators had the foresight to preserve biological evidence properly, understanding that forensic science was always advancing and that techniques that didn't exist today might be available tomorrow. The apartment had been ransacked, but this didn't appear to be a simple burglary gone wrong. Nothing of obvious value seemed to have been taken. Instead, the evidence suggested something far more sinister. The sexual assault kit performed during Laura's autopsy would later confirm what investigators suspected from the crime scene. This had been a sexually motivated attack. The autopsy. The autopsy performed on Laura Kempton that afternoon provided crucial information about what had happened to her. The medical examiner determined that Laura had died from massive trauma to the left side of her head. The injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly by a blunt object, the glass bottle found at the scene. She had suffered contusions and lacerations of the brain, along with extensive skull fractures. These were devastating injuries that would have caused rapid death. The autopsy also confirmed that Laura had been sexually assaulted. Vaginal swabs and other samples were collected and preserved. In 1981, these samples couldn't tell investigators much beyond confirming that sexual assault had occurred, but they would prove crucial decades later when DNA technology advanced enough to extract genetic profiles from old evidence. The medical examiner concluded that Laura had died in the early morning hours of September 28, 1981, which aligned with witness statements about when she'd been seen entering her apartment alone. The timeline was beginning to come together. Laura had returned home in the early hours of the morning, unaware that someone had broken into her apartment and was lying in wait. An attack had occurred, violent and brutal. And then Laura was dead. Her life ended at just 23 years old, her dreams and potential snuffed out in an act of senseless violence. Part 2. The initial investigation. The first 48 hours. In any homicide investigation, the first 48 hours are critical. This is when memories are freshest, when witnesses are most likely to come forward, when physical evidence is still abundant and uncontaminated. The Portsmouth Police Department understood this, and they threw every available resource at Laura Kempton's case. Detectives began by interviewing everyone who had known Laura or had any connection to her. Her friends from beauty school were questioned about her recent activities, her mood, whether she'd mentioned any problems or conflicts with anyone. Her co-workers from Macro Polo and Karen's ice cream parlor were asked the same questions. Had Laura seemed worried about anything? Had she mentioned any threatening encounters? Had anyone been hanging around, paying unwanted attention to her? The man Laura had been dating, the one who'd spent the night before her murder with her, immediately became a person of interest, as would be standard in any homicide investigation. Statistics show that when a woman is murdered, the perpetrator is often someone she knows, frequently a current or former intimate partner. But this man had an alibi for the early morning hours when Laura was killed, and he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The results, which wouldn't be available for years when the technology advanced enough to process them properly, would eventually clear him completely. Investigators canvassed Laura's neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the early morning hours of September 28th. Had anyone noticed someone loitering around 20 Chapel Street? Had anyone heard sounds of a struggle or screams? The apartment building's other residents were interviewed extensively. This was delicate work. Investigators needed information, but they also didn't want to cause panic in a community already shaken by such a violent crime. The broken door panel became a key focus of the investigation. Someone had broken that panel to gain access to Laura's apartment. Based on the evidence, this appeared to have happened before Laura returned home. The killer had broken in and waited for her. This suggested a level of calculation, of intent, that made the crime even more chilling. This wasn't a random encounter that escalated. Someone had targeted Laura's apartment specifically and had been willing to wait for her to return. But why? That was the question that would haunt investigators for decades. Was there something about Laura specifically that had drawn the killer's attention? Or was this more random than it appeared? Someone looking for an apartment to break into, choosing Laura's for reasons that had nothing to do with her as a person? Developing a profile. As the investigation continued through those first critical days and weeks, investigators began to develop a profile of the crime and the likely perpetrator. The break-in suggested someone with criminal experience, someone comfortable with committing burglary. The sexual assault indicated a predator, someone who saw an opportunity for violence and took it. The level of violence used, striking Laura repeatedly with the bottle even after she would have been incapacitated, suggested rage, possibly drug or alcohol-fueled, possibly just the nature of this particular offender. Portsmouth, in the early 1980s, like many American cities, was dealing with property crime. Burglaries were not uncommon, and investigators looked into whether there had been other break-ins in Laura's neighborhood. Were there any patterns that might connect to her murder? Had anyone else reported suspicious activity around their apartments? The police also looked into known sex offenders in the area. In 1981, sex offender registries weren't what they would later become, but police maintained their own records of individuals who'd been convicted of sexual assault or other sex crimes. Any such individuals living in Portsmouth or the surrounding area were looked at closely. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded outward. Detectives contacted police departments in surrounding communities, asking about similar unsolved murders or sexual assaults. Was it possible that Laura's killer had struck before elsewhere, or might he strike again if he wasn't caught? The evidence problem. The physical evidence collected from Laura's apartment was carefully preserved and analyzed using the forensic techniques available in 1981. Fingerprints were compared against prints in police databases, but no matches came back. The cigarette butt was preserved, but in 1981, there was no way to extract useful identification information from it beyond blood type. This was the frustrating reality of criminal investigation in the early 1980s. Forensic science had come a long way since mid-century. Fingerprint analysis was well established, blood typing could narrow down suspects, hair and fiber analysis could provide circumstantial evidence. But the kind of definitive identification that DNA analysis would later provide simply didn't exist yet. Investigators knew they had evidence from the killer. They knew he'd left biological material at the scene. In the cigarette butt, in the sexual assault evidence, possibly in other samples as well. But they had no way to use that evidence to identify him. No database to compare it against. No technology that could turn those biological samples into a name and face. This is one of the cruel realities of cold cases. Sometimes the evidence that could solve a case exists from day one, carefully preserved and documented, but it sits uselessly in an evidence room because the technology to analyze it properly doesn't exist yet. It's like having a locked door with the key sitting right in front of you, but no understanding of how keys and locks work. You know the answer is there. You just can't access it. For investigators working Laura's case, this must have been maddening. They had evidence. They had DNA, though they didn't fully understand that yet. They had a killer's genetic fingerprint, unique in all the world, just waiting for the right technology to come along and identify its owner. But that technology was years away, and in the meantime, all they could do was follow traditional investigative methods and hope for a breakthrough. Leads and dead ends. Over the following months and years, Portsmouth police pursued hundreds of leads in Laura Kempton's case. Every tip that came in was investigated, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Every person who'd had any connection to Laura was looked at and, if necessary, ruled out. The investigation was thorough and professional, following every standard protocol for homicide investigations. But despite all this work, no clear suspect emerged. There were people of interest, certainly. There were individuals who couldn't quite account for their whereabouts during the critical hours. There were known criminals who lived in the area and had histories that made them worth investigating. But nothing ever solidified into probable cause for an arrest. The investigation also had to contend with the natural limitations of witness memory and the passage of time. Witnesses who might have seen something important in those early morning hours might not have realized it was significant. By the time they were interviewed, days or weeks might have passed, and memories faded. Details got confused or forgotten. This is why the first 48 hours are so critical. The more time that passes, the harder it becomes to get reliable information from witnesses. As 1981 turned into 1982 and then into 1983, Laura Kempton's case began that inexorable slide from active investigation to cold case. It wasn't that anyone gave up on it, not exactly. New leads were still pursued. The case file was still reviewed periodically. But with no new evidence and no new witnesses coming forward, there was only so much detectives could do. Other crimes happened, demanding attention and resources. Slowly, inevitably, Laura's case became one of those files that lived in a back room, a reminder of justice delayed and perhaps denied. Part 3. a second tragedy, and growing fears. October 19th, 1982. Tammy Little. Just over a year after Laura Kempton's murder, Portsmouth was rocked by another horrific crime that seemed impossible to ignore. On October 19th, 1982, 20-year-old Tammy Little was found dead in her apartment at 315 Maplewood Avenue. Like Laura, Tammy was a student at Portsmouth Beauty School. Like Laura, she lived in a first-floor apartment. And like Laura, she had died from massive head injuries. The similarities were striking and deeply unsettling. Two young women, both beauty school students, both killed in their own apartments in brutal attacks. The question that everyone in Portsmouth was asking, and that investigators were asking themselves, was whether they were dealing with a serial killer. This is one of those moments in criminal investigation where the truth can feel almost as disturbing as confirmation would be. On one hand, if the same person killed both Laura and Tammy, that meant there was a serial killer operating in Portsmouth, someone who might strike again. On the other hand, if these were two separate killers, that meant Portsmouth had been struck by random, horrific violence twice in just over a year, a statistical improbability that raised its own disturbing questions about what was happening in their community. Investigators looked closely for connections between the two cases. Were there any physical evidence similarities? Did the crimes share a signature or method of operation that would suggest the same perpetrator? They compared witness statements, timelines, evidence collected from both crime scenes. But frustratingly, despite the surface similarities, there wasn't enough to definitively link the cases. The evidence was circumstantial. The similarities could be coincidental, or they could indicate a copycat, or they could indeed mean the same person had killed both women. Without more concrete evidence, investigators couldn't say for certain. For the Portsmouth community, this uncertainty was perhaps worse than knowing. Parents worried about their daughters. Young women in the city found themselves looking over their shoulders, double-checking locks, maybe rethinking that ground-floor apartment they'd been considering. The psychological impact of unsolved violent crimes on a community can't be overstated. It erodes the sense of safety that people need to live their lives fully. At the July 20th, 2023 press conference announcing the resolution of Laura Kempton's case, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella was asked directly about Tammy Little's murder and whether Ronney James Lee might also be responsible for her death. His answer was carefully measured. That case remains under investigation. It is our hope that what we're announcing today may lead to some additional information about that case. In other words, as of 2023, Tammy Little's murder remains unsolved, and while investigators haven't ruled out a connection to Lee, they also haven't found evidence definitively linking him to her death. The impact on the investigation. The Tammy Little murder had a complex effect on the Laura Kempton investigation. On one hand, it refocused attention and resources on both cases. If there was a serial killer operating in Portsmouth, that was obviously a major priority, but it also meant spreading investigative resources across two complex cases rather than focusing on one. Investigators looked for any common denominators beyond the obvious ones. Did Laura and Tammy know each other? They'd both attended Portsmouth Beauty School, though they were in different classes, and there's no indication they were friends or even acquainted. Did they frequent the same places, shop at the same stores? Did they have any friends or acquaintances in common? The investigators also had to consider the possibility that someone connected to the beauty school was involved. Was there an instructor, a maintenance worker, someone with access to student information who might have targeted these two women? Background checks were conducted, alibis were verified, and people were interviewed and re-interviewed. But once again, despite exhaustive investigation, no clear connection emerged. The cases stubbornly refused to reveal their secrets. Ronney James Lee enters the picture. What makes all of this particularly interesting in hindsight is that during this exact period, Ronney James Lee was very much on Portsmouth Police's radar, just not for murder. In November 1982, just a month after Tammy Little's murder, Lee was arrested on an attempted theft charge. This was the beginning of a series of encounters between Lee and Portsmouth Police that would continue through 1983. Between 1982 and 1983, Lee was linked to 4 residential burglaries and 1 commercial burglary in the Portsmouth area. This was exactly the kind of criminal activity that investigators had been looking for when trying to develop leads in Laura's case, someone with a history of breaking into apartments. But Lee was never connected to the murders at the time. There was no physical evidence linking him to either crime scene, no witness testimony placing him near either apartment building at the relevant times, and apparently nothing in his behavior during questioning that raised red flags about possible involvement in the homicides. This is one of the great frustrations of criminal investigation. In hindsight, with the benefit of knowing what we know now, it seems obvious that Lee should have been looked at more closely for Laura's murder. He was the right age. He lived in Portsmouth. He was actively committing burglaries in the area during the exact time period when someone broke into Laura's apartment. The pattern of behavior was right there. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight. In 1982 and 1983, Lee was one of many people in Portsmouth who had criminal records, who might theoretically have been capable of murder. Without physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, there was no reason to focus on him more than anyone else. And crucially, DNA technology that could have definitively placed him at Laura's apartment wouldn't become widely available for several more years. 1987. Lee's criminal pattern becomes clearer. In 1987, Ronney James Lee's criminal trajectory took a darker turn. He was convicted of charges stemming from a burglary in Keene, New Hampshire, a city about 50 miles west of Portsmouth. But this wasn't just a burglary. While burglarizing a home, Lee sexually assaulted a woman who was present during the break-in. This conviction is significant for several reasons. First, it definitively established that Lee was capable of sexual violence, not just property crime. Second, it showed that Lee's pattern of breaking into homes could escalate to violence against the occupants. Third, it demonstrated that Lee was willing to act on sexual impulses during the commission of other crimes. For this crime, Lee was sentenced to prison, where he remained from December 1987 until July 1990. During his incarceration, investigators working Laura Kempton's case, and presumably Tammy Little's as well, continued their work, unaware that one of their answers was sitting in a state prison cell about 50 miles away. When Lee was released in 1990, he returned to civilian life. The nature of his subsequent years isn't entirely clear from public records, but we know he continued living in New Hampshire for some period. His criminal record from this point forward, at least as it pertains to arrests and convictions, isn't publicly detailed. We know that he struggled with substance abuse. His eventual cause of death would be acute cocaine intoxication, but the specifics of his life in the 1990s and early 2000s remain mostly opaque. Part 4. The Long Wait. The 1990s, a case going cold. As the 1990s dawned, Laura Kempton's case was more than a decade old. The detectives who'd worked it initially were retiring or moving on to other assignments. The case file, thick with reports and witness statements and dead-end leads, sat in the Portsmouth Police Department's storage, a reminder of a job left unfinished. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. Police departments, particularly smaller ones where violent crime is relatively rare, don't forget their unsolved homicides. Someone was always responsible for maintaining the case file, for reviewing it periodically to see if new information had come to light, for being ready to pursue any new leads that might develop. For Laura's family, these years must have been agonizing. The acute grief of the first months and years after her death would have evolved into a chronic ache, a permanent wound that never quite healed. Birthdays and holidays were marked by absence. The anniversary of her death came around every year, a brutal reminder of what had been lost and what remained unknown. This is the hidden toll of unsolved crimes. The direct victim's suffering ends with their death, terrible as that is. But the family's suffering continues day after day, year after year, complicated by the not knowing. Without answers, without resolution, the grieving process can't complete itself. Questions hang in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Who killed Laura? Why? Did they know her? Was it random? Are they still out there? Will there ever be justice? The dawn of DNA. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to forensic science that would eventually crack Laura's case wide open. Though no one knew it at the time, DNA profiling, first used in criminal investigations in the late 1980s, became increasingly sophisticated and reliable throughout the 1990s. The science behind DNA profiling is elegant in its simplicity and power. Every person, except identical twins, has a unique genetic code. When someone leaves biological material behind, blood, saliva, semen, skin cells, they're leaving their genetic fingerprint. By analyzing this material, forensic scientists can create a DNA profile that can then be compared to other profiles. In 1994, the FBI established CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. This national database allowed law enforcement agencies to upload DNA profiles from crime scenes and compare them against DNA profiles from convicted offenders. The theory was simple: many criminals are repeat offenders. Someone who commits a burglary in 1985 and leaves DNA behind might get arrested for something else in 1995 and be required to provide a DNA sample. When that sample gets uploaded to CODIS, it can be automatically compared against unsolved crime scene DNA profiles. If there's a match, a case that's been cold for a decade suddenly has a viable suspect. This was revolutionary. For the first time, evidence that had been sitting uselessly in evidence rooms for years or decades could potentially solve cases. Cold cases that had seemed hopeless could be reopened with renewed vigor. 2003, a major step forward. In January 2003, investigators working Laura Kempton's case took a significant step. They obtained a DNA sample from the man Laura had been dating, the one she had spent time with the night before her murder. He'd always been a person of interest, simply by virtue of his relationship with Laura. But he'd had an alibi and had cooperated fully with investigators. Still, with DNA technology now available, it made sense to definitively rule him out or implicate him. The results were definitive. He was not a match to the DNA found at Laura's apartment. This was good news for him, obviously, but it was also important information for the investigation. It meant the killer was someone else, someone who hadn't yet been identified. That same year, 2003, investigators took another crucial step. Using the biological evidence collected from Laura's apartment in 1981, the cigarette butt, samples from the sexual assault kit, and other materials, forensic scientists were able to develop a complete DNA profile of Laura's killer. This was a major accomplishment. After 22 years, they finally had a genetic fingerprint of the person responsible for her death. This DNA profile was uploaded to every database available, CODIS, naturally, but also state and local databases, Interpol's international database, anywhere that might yield a match. The hope was that Laura's killer had been arrested somewhere, sometime, for something, and had been required to provide a DNA sample. If that had happened, they'd get a match and finally have their suspect. But no match came back. Whoever had killed Laura either had never been arrested for a serious enough crime to require DNA collection, or had died before providing a sample, or had somehow slipped through the cracks of the system. This was deeply frustrating. They had the genetic equivalent of a photograph of the killer, but they couldn't identify who it was. 2003 to 2021, the waiting continues. From 2003 to 2021, Laura's DNA profile sat in databases, automatically compared against every new profile that was uploaded. This is one of the beautiful things about CODIS. It's not a static system. Every time someone is convicted of a qualifying crime and provides a DNA sample, that sample is automatically compared against all unsolved crime scene profiles in the database. All it would take is for Laura's killer to get arrested anywhere in the country for a serious crime, and the system would flag a match. But year after year, no match came. The databases grew larger. More states passed laws requiring DNA collection from arrestees, not just convicted offenders. The pool of profiles expanded dramatically, but still nothing. During these years, Portsmouth police continued to investigate the case when resources allowed. Periodically, a detective would pull the file and review it, looking for something that might have been missed, some lead that could be pursued with fresh eyes. Cold case units, which became more common in police departments during this period, sometimes took a look at Laura's file. The evidence was all there, carefully preserved according to proper chain of custody protocols. The DNA profile was solid and reliable. They just needed a name to go with it. Part 5. The Breakthrough. 2018. The Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, something happened in California that would eventually reverberate through cold case investigations across the entire country, including Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Authorities announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the infamous Golden State Killer who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s with a series of murders, rapes, and burglaries. DeAngelo had evaded capture for decades, and the case had long been cold. But investigators had used a revolutionary technique to identify him: forensic genetic genealogy. They'd taken DNA from old crime scenes and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people who'd taken commercial ancestry tests could voluntarily upload their results to find relatives. The DNA from the Golden State Killer's crimes didn't match anyone directly in the database, but it found distant cousins, third and fourth cousins who shared segments of DNA with the killer. From there, genetic genealogists built family trees, identified common ancestors, and eventually worked their way down through the generations to identify D'Angelo as a suspect. When investigators confirmed his identity by collecting his DNA from items he'd discarded in public, it was a definitive match. The technique sent shockwaves through law enforcement. If it worked for a case as old and as complex as the Golden State Killer, it could work for other cold cases. Suddenly, DNA that had been sitting uselessly in databases for decades because it didn't match anyone directly could be used in an entirely new way. Even without a direct match, even if the killer had never provided a DNA sample to any database, their relatives might have, and relatives were enough to build a family tree that could lead to the killer. This was a paradigm shift. For decades, DNA evidence had been powerful but limited. You needed something to compare it to. Now, with genetic genealogy, you could potentially identify suspects even if they'd never had any contact with law enforcement, never provided a DNA sample, never appeared in any database. All you needed was for enough of their relatives to have taken ancestry tests. 2021, considering new options. In 2021, investigators working cold cases in New Hampshire, including Laura Kempton's, began seriously discussing the potential of forensic genetic genealogy. The technique had proven itself not just with the Golden State Killer, but with dozens of other cold cases across the country. Cases that had seemed hopeless were being solved. Killers who'd thought they'd gotten away with murder decades ago were being identified and, if still alive, arrested. Laura's case seemed like a perfect candidate for this approach. The DNA profile from her crime scene was strong and complete. The crime had occurred in the United States, which increased the odds that relatives might be in American genealogy databases, and there were no legal barriers preventing the use of genetic genealogy. It had been tested in courts across the country and had consistently been upheld. But there was a significant obstacle: funding. Forensic genetic genealogy isn't cheap. The process involves not just uploading DNA to databases, but then having trained genetic genealogists spend weeks or months building family trees, tracking down records, and identifying potential suspects. For a small city police department, the cost, which could run into tens of thousands of dollars, was prohibitive. Investigators in Portsmouth and in the New Hampshire Attorney General's Cold Case Unit began exploring options. There were grants specifically designated for cold case investigations. There were federal programs that might help with funding. And there was always the possibility of private donations, perhaps from community members who remembered Laura's case and wanted to see it solved. This is one of the frustrating realities of modern criminal investigation. The technology exists to solve many cold cases, but it's expensive, and police budgets are tight. Agencies have to make difficult choices about how to allocate limited resources. Do you fund the genetic genealogy analysis that might solve a decades-old case? Or do you use that money to hire an additional patrol officer for active cases? Both are valid uses of limited funds, but someone has to make the choice. May 2022, the match. In May 2022, Detective Eric Widerstrom of the Portsmouth Police Department received a notification that would change everything. A DNA profile that had been uploaded to a third-party public genetic genealogy database showed a familial relationship to the DNA profile from Laura Kempton's crime scene. This wasn't a direct match. Laura's killer wasn't in the database himself, but someone who was related to him was. The genetic markers indicated this person was a close enough relative that they likely shared great-great-grandparents with the killer. This was exactly the kind of break that investigators had been hoping for. The Portsmouth Police Department immediately began working with a multi-agency task force that included the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory, the Maine State Police Forensic Laboratory, the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and Identifinders International, a private company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The process that followed was painstaking and methodical. Genetic genealogists examined the match and began building family trees. Using public records, census data, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and other documents, they worked backward from the genetic match to identify common ancestors. These ancestors had lived generations ago, possibly in the 1800s, and had had multiple children who in turn had multiple children, creating sprawling family trees with hundreds or thousands of descendants. The genealogists then had to work forward through those family trees, identifying every descendant of those common ancestors. Somewhere in that vast network of relatives was the person whose DNA had been left at Laura Kempton's crime scene. The challenge was narrowing down from potentially hundreds of candidates to a specific individual. This required considering various factors. The killer had been in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1981, so investigators could eliminate anyone who could be proven to have been living far away from New Hampshire at that time. The killer was almost certainly male, based on the nature of the crime and the DNA evidence, so female descendants could be eliminated. The killer was likely in his teens, 20s, or 30s in 1981, based on typical demographics of violent offenders, so anyone too young or too old could be eliminated. Through this process of elimination, the genealogists began to narrow the field. Certain branches of the family tree became more promising than others. Certain individuals emerged as more likely candidates. And eventually, one name kept appearing in the research: Ronney James Lee. June 2023, confirmation. Lee had several factors that made him a strong candidate. He was born in 1960, making him 21 years old in September 1981, the right age profile. He had served in the US Army and had been discharged in May 1981, just a few months before Laura's murder. Crucially, after his discharge, he had worked as a security guard at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth from June 1981 until August 1982. He was living in Portsmouth at the exact time of Laura's murder. Moreover, his criminal history fit the profile of Laura's killer. Between 1982 and 1983, Lee had been linked to 4 residential burglaries and 1 commercial burglary in Portsmouth. He was someone who broke into people's homes, and his 1987 conviction for a burglary that included sexual assault demonstrated he was capable of exactly the kind of crime that had been committed against Laura. But being a promising candidate wasn't enough. Investigators needed definitive proof. They needed Lee's actual DNA to compare against the crime scene evidence. There was one major complication. Ronney James Lee had died on February 9, 2005, at the age of 45, from acute cocaine intoxication. He'd been dead for more than 17 years by the time investigators identified him as a suspect. This meant they couldn't simply approach him and ask for a DNA sample. However, Lee had undergone an autopsy following his death. This was standard procedure for deaths involving drug overdoses, particularly in cases where there might be questions about whether the death was accidental, intentional, or possibly involved foul play. During that autopsy, blood samples had been collected and preserved on what's called a blood card, filter paper that absorbs blood and can be stored long-term. Investigators contacted the Office of the Medical Examiner that had performed Lee's autopsy. In 2022, they were able to obtain Lee's blood card from his 2005 autopsy. This blood card still contained viable DNA, even after 17 years of storage. In June 2023, forensic scientists extracted DNA from Lee's blood card and compared it to the DNA profile from Laura Kempton's crime scene. The samples they compared included the cigarette butt found near Laura's body, vaginal swabs from the sexual assault kit, and other biological evidence collected in 1981. The results were definitive. Ronney James Lee's DNA matched the DNA from Laura's crime scene. The statistical probability that the DNA came from someone other than Lee was approximately 1 in 9.4 trillion, essentially impossible. After 42 years, Laura Kempton's killer had been identified. Part 6. The Resolution. Preparing for the announcement. Once Lee's identity was confirmed, investigators faced the delicate task of preparing to make their findings public. This involved several considerations. First, they needed to inform Laura's family before any public announcement was made. After more than 4 decades of waiting, they deserved to hear the news directly from law enforcement, not from the media. Second, investigators needed to compile a comprehensive report documenting their findings. This report would need to detail the original investigation, the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy process that led to Lee's identification, and the confirmation through his autopsy blood card. The report needed to be thorough enough to withstand scrutiny from the media, the public, and potentially from legal challenges if any arose. Third, there was the question of what exactly they were announcing. Lee was dead. He couldn't be arrested. He couldn't stand trial. There would be no criminal prosecution, no day in court, no opportunity for a jury to hear the evidence and render a verdict. In the strictest legal sense, Lee would never be convicted of Laura's murder because he was no longer alive to be charged. But investigators and prosecutors were confident in their conclusions. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Lee's presence in Portsmouth at the time of the murder, his history of burglaries in the area, his pattern of escalating to sexual violence during break-ins, everything fit. As the Attorney General's report would later state, the evidence establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that Ronney James Lee committed first-degree murder. If Lee had still been alive, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella said, his office would have sought charges of first-degree murder against him on 2 alternative theories: knowingly causing Laura Kempton's death before, during, or after engaging in or attempting to engage in aggravated felonious sexual assault, and purposely causing her death by striking her with a blunt object. July 20th, 2023, the press conference. On Thursday, July the 20th, 2023, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella and Portsmouth Police Chief Mark Newport held a press conference at Portsmouth City Hall. The announcement they were about to make had been 42 years in the making. Formella began by providing the basic facts of the case. On September 28, 1981, Laura Kempton, a 23-year-old beauty school student, had been found murdered in her Portsmouth apartment. The case had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, despite hundreds of leads being pursued and numerous potential suspects being investigated. Then, Formella revealed what everyone had gathered to hear. Through the use of forensic genetic genealogy technology, investigators had identified Ronney James Lee as the person responsible for Laura's death. Lee, who had been 21 years old at the time of the murder, had died in 2005 from acute cocaine intoxication. No arrest would be made and no prosecution would occur because the perpetrator was deceased. Formella provided details about Lee's background, his military service, his employment in Portsmouth at the time of the murder, his subsequent criminal history, including the 1987 conviction for burglary with sexual assault. He explained how genetic genealogy had led investigators to Lee and how Lee's DNA from his 2005 autopsy had confirmed the match. Chief Mark Newport spoke about the Portsmouth Police Department's commitment to the case over the decades. Laura was a victim of an unspeakable act of violence, Newport said. The members of the Portsmouth Police Department have never forgotten about Laura and any of the other victims of our unsolved homicides. Formella characterized the day as bittersweet. There was satisfaction in finally solving the case, in being able to tell Laura's family who had killed her. But there was also sadness that Lee had died before being held accountable, that Laura's family would never see him face trial, that true justice in the courtroom sense would never be achieved. It is my hope that this conclusion and announcement will be the long-awaited first step in providing what closure the criminal justice system can provide for Laura Kempton's family and community, Formella said. The Portsmouth Police Department should be commended for its commitment and perseverance in seeking justice for Ms. Kempton and her family. Formella also used the announcement to send a broader message. I hope it will also send a message that we will never stop working these cases and never forget about these victims. And we will never stop looking for new leads, new technologies to solve these cases. And then, perhaps most importantly, he added what could be interpreted as a warning to anyone else who thought they'd gotten away with murder. We're never going to stop looking for you. We're never going to stop coming for you. The family's response. Laura's family released a statement through the Attorney General's office. The statement expressed what they must have been feeling after 42 years of waiting for this moment. The Kempton family wishes to express our deepest gratitude to the Portsmouth Police Department for solving Laura's case. Their diligence and determination, along with extraordinary personal commitment over the past decades, have led to this moment for Laura. The statement specifically acknowledged retired Captain John Paraki of the Portsmouth Police Department's Investigative Division and his team members, past and present, who had worked on Laura's case. Many other hands have touched Laura's file over the past 41 years, and the family expresses our deepest gratitude to all who contributed. The statement continued. The family also requested privacy as they processed this news. After more than 4 decades of living with uncertainty, they finally had answers. But answers, while necessary and important, don't erase grief. They don't bring Laura back. They don't undo 42 years of living with a hole in their family where she should have been. What they do provide is a different kind of peace. The peace of knowing, of having the mystery solved, of being able to finally close one chapter even as the larger chapter of grief and loss continues. The family could now know with certainty who had killed Laura and why. They could stop wondering if the killer was still out there, still a threat. They could stop hoping that each year might finally be the year that brought answers. The answers had finally come. And while they came far too late, 42 years too late, they came. The public reaction. The announcement of the Laura Kempton case resolution made national news. This was partly because of the 42-year gap between the crime and its resolution, but also because it represented another successful application of forensic genetic genealogy to a seemingly unsolvable cold case. News outlets from New Hampshire to California covered the story. Cable news channels discussed it. True crime podcasts analyzed it. Laura's story, which had faded from public consciousness decades ago, was suddenly being told to a national audience. For many people, especially those interested in criminal justice and forensic science, the case represented both the power and the promise of genetic genealogy. Here was a woman who'd been brutally murdered in 1981, when DNA profiling didn't even exist yet. Evidence had been carefully collected and preserved even though there was no way to use it at the time. 42 years later, using technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who'd worked the case initially, that evidence finally revealed the killer's identity. The case also sparked discussions about the ethics and privacy implications of forensic genetic genealogy. When people submit their DNA to ancestry websites, are they consenting to have that information used by law enforcement? What about their relatives who never submitted DNA themselves but can be identified through genetic connections? Different people had different views on these questions, and the debate continues. For Portsmouth itself, the announcement brought a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction that a decades-old mystery had been solved, that Laura's family finally had answers, that the case demonstrated how far forensic science had come. But there was also frustration that Lee had died before facing justice, and concern about the one other major unsolved case that continued to haunt the city, the murder of Tammy Little. Part 7. Understanding Ronney James Lee. Who was he? With Lee identified as Laura's killer, the question naturally arose. Who was this man? What kind of person breaks into a stranger's apartment, lies in wait, and then brutally murders and sexually assaults a young woman? Ronney James Lee was born in 1960. His mother had moved to Portsmouth in 1960, and Lee grew up in the area. His early life isn't well documented in public records, but we know he joined the U.S. Army as a young man. He served until May 1981, receiving an honorable discharge. There's no indication from his military records of any disciplinary problems or red flags that would have predicted future violent behavior. After leaving the Army in May 1981, Lee moved back to Portsmouth and lived with his mother. He found work as a security guard at Liberty Mutual, a position he held from June 1981 until August 1982. On the surface, he might have seemed like many other young men in Portsmouth at the time, a veteran trying to establish himself in civilian life, working a job, figuring out his future. But beneath that surface, something darker was operating. Within months of starting his security guard job, in September 1981, Lee broke into Laura Kempton's apartment and killed her. Over the following 2 years, he would be linked to 4 residential burglaries and 1 commercial burglary. This pattern suggests someone for whom breaking into homes had become almost routine, someone who didn't see other people's spaces or safety as deserving of respect. Then came the 1987 incident in Keene. Lee burglarized a home, and when he found a woman there, he sexually assaulted her. This crime resulted in his only significant prison sentence, incarceration from December 1987 to July 1990. It also demonstrated that his criminal behavior wasn't limited to property crime. When the opportunity arose, Lee was willing and able to commit acts of sexual violence. The psychology of a killer. Based on what we know about Lee and his crimes, what can we infer about his psychology? It's important to note that without extensive psychological evaluation, which obviously can't be conducted posthumously, any analysis is somewhat speculative. But certain patterns are evident. Lee exhibited what criminologists call instrumental criminal behavior. His break-ins weren't crimes of passion or the result of sudden impulses. They were calculated acts. He planned them, prepared for them, executed them. The break-in at Laura's apartment, breaking the door panel to gain access, then waiting inside for her to return, showed planning and patience. The escalation from burglary to sexual assault and murder is a pattern seen in some serial offenders. Investigators often describe a progression. Property crimes lead to crimes against people. Voyeurism leads to assault. Initial crimes with lower levels of violence escalate to more serious violence. Lee's trajectory fits this pattern. He started with burglaries, or at least that's the earliest crime we know about with certainty. Then came murder with sexual assault in 1981. Then more burglaries in 1982 to 1983. Then burglary with sexual assault in 1987. This could suggest that when Lee broke into homes, he was looking for more than just property. He was looking for opportunities for violence, for sexual assault, for exercising power and control over others. The fact that his 1987 keen crime involved assaulting a woman who was home during the burglary is particularly significant. A burglar who's solely interested in theft typically chooses times when homes are empty. A burglar who encounters an unexpected occupant typically flees. Lee didn't flee, he attacked. The level of violence used against Laura, striking her repeatedly with a bottle even after she would have been incapacitated, suggests rage or a complete lack of empathy, or both. This wasn't the minimal violence necessary to commit the robbery or assault. This was excessive, brutal, the kind of violence that speaks to something deeply wrong in the perpetrator's psyche. The substance abuse connection. Lee's death from acute cocaine intoxication in 2005 points to another factor that may have played a role in his life and crimes: substance abuse. We don't know when Lee's drug use began, or how severe it was at various points in his life. We don't know if he was using drugs at the time of Laura's murder, though it's certainly possible. What we do know is that substance abuse and criminal behavior often intersect. Drugs lower inhibitions, impair judgment, and can lead people to commit crimes they might not otherwise commit. Drug addiction also creates financial pressures that can motivate property crimes like burglary. And for some people, drugs become a way of coping with guilt or trauma, including guilt over crimes they've committed. It's possible that Lee's drug use was both a contributing factor to his crimes and a consequence of them. The man who killed Laura in 1981 was 21 years old. The man who died in 2005 was 45, having spent roughly half his adult life as a drug user and criminal offender. That's a tragic trajectory, though it doesn't excuse anything he did or diminish the harm he caused. Why Laura? One of the most painful questions for Laura's family, and one that can never be fully answered, is why Laura? Why did Lee choose her apartment to break into that night? Was there something about her specifically that drew his attention, or was it more random than that? Based on the evidence and Lee's criminal history, investigators believe Laura was likely a victim of opportunity rather than a targeted victim. There's no indication that Lee knew Laura or had any previous connection to her. He wasn't a stalker who'd been following her. He wasn't someone from her social circle or workplace. They moved in entirely different worlds until the moment he broke into her apartment. The Attorney General's report describes the crime as a calculated break-in and a sexually motivated crime that resulted in more violence than the perpetrator originally anticipated. This could suggest that Lee's initial intent was sexual assault and that the murder happened when Laura fought back or when things escalated beyond what Lee had planned. Or it's possible Lee had burglarized Laura's apartment at some earlier point, had seen that a young woman lived alone there, and had returned specifically targeting her. The broken door panel suggests forced entry, but we don't know if Lee had broken in before using a different method. What seems clear is that Lee chose Laura's apartment because she was a young woman living alone in a ground-floor apartment that he could access relatively easily. She fit a victim profile: vulnerable, accessible, alone. That's the cold, terrible logic of predatory criminals. They choose victims based on opportunity and vulnerability, not because of anything specific about the victim as a person. This is both horrifying and, in a strange way, important for Laura's family to understand. Laura didn't do anything wrong. She didn't somehow invite this attack or make herself a target through any action or inaction. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, in her own apartment where she should have been completely safe. What happened to her was a complete violation of the fundamental right we all have to feel secure in our own home. The years after 1981. What was Lee's life like after he killed Laura? He continued working his security guard job through August 1982, about 11 months after the murder. During this time, he was apparently committing burglaries in the Portsmouth area, eventually being arrested in November 1982 on an attempted theft charge. Did he think about Laura? Did he feel guilt or remorse? Did he worry about getting caught? We can't know, but his continued criminal activity suggests he wasn't consumed by guilt. He kept breaking into homes, kept taking what wasn't his, kept putting himself in situations where he had access to vulnerable people. The 1987 Keene assault and his subsequent prison time from 1987 to 1990 represent the only time Lee faced serious consequences for his actions. 3 years in prison isn't nothing, but it's a relatively short sentence considering the crime. When he was released in July 1990, he'd served his time and was theoretically rehabilitated, ready to re-enter society as a productive citizen. But clearly, Lee continued to struggle. His death in 2005 from cocaine intoxication suggests that whatever demons he was wrestling with, guilt, trauma, addiction, underlying mental health issues, he never successfully overcame them. He lived only 45 years, dying more than 2 decades younger than the average life expectancy for American men. In a sense, Lee was both a perpetrator and a victim. Not a victim in any way comparable to Laura, of course, but a victim of his own choices, his own addictions, his own inability to function successfully in society. That's a tragedy too, though a self-inflicted one that pales in comparison to the tragedy he inflicted on Laura and her family. Could he have been stopped? One of the most difficult questions to contemplate is whether Lee could have been stopped before he killed Laura. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see warning signs. He was breaking into homes, showing a pattern of behavior that could escalate to violence. After Laura's murder, he continued burglarizing homes, demonstrating that her death hadn't deterred him or caused him to change his behavior. But in 1981, without DNA technology that could have connected him to Laura's crime scene, how could he have been stopped? He was arrested for burglaries, but burglary is typically treated as a property crime, not a violent crime. Prison sentences are relatively short, and rehabilitation programs that might address the underlying issues driving criminal behavior are often underfunded and ineffective. This points to larger questions about the criminal justice system. How do we identify people who are at risk of escalating from property crimes to violent crimes? How do we intervene effectively? How do we balance punishment with rehabilitation? How do we protect potential future victims while also respecting the rights of people who've served their time for previous offenses? These questions don't have easy answers, and Lee's case doesn't provide them. What his case does provide is one more data point in the ongoing discussion about criminal behavior, risk assessment, and the challenges of preventing violent crime before it happens. Part 8. The science that solved the case. The evolution of DNA technology. To truly appreciate how Laura Kempton's case was solved, it's important to understand the technological journey from 1981 to 2023. When Laura was murdered, DNA profiling in criminal investigations essentially didn't exist. The science behind DNA had been understood for decades. James Watson and Francis Crick had discovered the double helix structure of DNA in 1953, but translating that scientific knowledge into a tool for criminal investigation took time. The first use of DNA profiling in a criminal investigation came in 1986 in England, when geneticist Alec Jeffreys used DNA to identify the killer in 2 rape-murder cases. The technique was crude by modern standards, but it worked. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA profiling was being used in criminal investigations in the United States and other countries. But these early techniques required relatively large samples of biological material and could be time-consuming and expensive. The DNA profiles they produced, while useful, weren't as detailed as what modern techniques can achieve, and crucially, there was no national database to compare DNA profiles against. If you had DNA from a crime scene, you needed a suspect to compare it to. Without a suspect, the DNA just sat there, potentially useful, but actually useless. The establishment of CODIS in 1994 changed this. For the first time, DNA profiles from unsolved crimes could be compared against a growing database of DNA from convicted offenders. States began passing laws requiring certain categories of offenders to provide DNA samples. Over time, these laws expanded to include more categories of crimes and, in some states, even arrestees who hadn't been convicted yet. By 2003, when investigators in Portsmouth were able to develop a DNA profile from Laura's case, the technology had advanced significantly. DNA could be extracted from smaller samples. Profiles were more detailed and reliable, and the databases were much larger. The profile from Laura's case was uploaded to every available database, and every time a new offender's DNA was added to those databases, it was automatically compared against Laura's profile. But still, no match came. This was the fundamental limitation of database searching. It only works if the person you're looking for is in the database. Genetic genealogy, a new paradigm. The development of commercial ancestry testing in the 2000s and 2010s created an entirely new paradigm for identifying suspects through DNA. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and others began offering affordable DNA tests that could tell people about their ethnic heritage and connect them with genetic relatives they might not have known about. These companies built massive databases of DNA profiles from millions of customers who had voluntarily submitted samples, hoping to learn about their ancestry or find relatives. And crucially, some of these databases allowed users to download their DNA data and upload it to third-party sites like GED Match, which specialized in helping people find genetic relatives. The key insight that led to forensic genetic genealogy was this: if you have DNA from a crime scene, you don't need to find the perpetrator in a database. You just need to find their relatives. Even distant relatives, third or fourth cousins, share enough DNA that genealogists can use them as a starting point to build family trees and eventually identify the perpetrator. This is exactly what happened with the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED Match. It didn't match anyone directly, but it found several distant cousins. Genetic genealogists then built family trees for those cousins, identified common ancestors, and worked forward through the generations until they identified Joseph James DeAngelo as a likely suspect. Traditional investigation confirmed his identity. The technique was revolutionary. Suddenly, DNA that had been sitting uselessly in evidence rooms because it didn't match anyone in CODIS could potentially solve cases. All that was needed was for enough of the perpetrator's relatives to have taken ancestry tests and uploaded their results to accessible databases. The GED Match controversy. The use of GED Match by law enforcement sparked significant controversy. The people who'd uploaded their DNA to GED Match had done so to find relatives or learn about their heritage, not to help police solve crimes. By using the database for criminal investigations, law enforcement was arguably using people's genetic information for purposes they hadn't consented to. GED Match responded to this controversy by changing their policies. Users now have to explicitly opt in if they want their DNA to be searchable by law enforcement. This reduced the size of the database available for forensic searchers, but made the use of the database more ethically sound. The broader debate about privacy and forensic genetic genealogy continues. Privacy advocates argue that people have a right to genetic privacy, and that using ancestry databases for law enforcement purposes violates that right. They also point out that you don't need to submit your own DNA to be identified through genetic genealogy. If enough of your relatives have submitted DNA, genealogists can potentially identify you even if you've never taken an ancestry test yourself. Law enforcement and victims advocates counter that solving violent crimes, bringing justice to victims and their families, and potentially preventing future crimes by identifying and apprehending dangerous offenders outweighs privacy concerns. They note that the databases being used are public databases where users have voluntarily uploaded their information, and that anyone uncomfortable with law enforcement access can simply not use these databases. There's no easy answer to this debate. Both sides raise valid points. The balance between privacy rights and public safety is one that society continues to grapple with, not just in the context of genetic genealogy, but in many areas where technology and law enforcement intersect. How it worked in Laura's case. When investigators uploaded Laura's suspect DNA profile to a genealogy database in 2022, they got matches to people who were distant relatives of the killer. These weren't close relatives, not parents or siblings or even first cousins. These were third or fourth cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the killer. Genetic genealogists from Identifinders International then took over. They built family trees for each of the genetic matches, working backward through the generations using census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, and other public documents. Eventually, they identified common ancestors that the matches all shared. These ancestors had lived generations ago, possibly in the 1800s. From those common ancestors, the genealogists then worked forward through time, identifying all the descendants. This created massive family trees with hundreds or potentially thousands of individuals. Somewhere in those trees was the person whose DNA had been left at Laura's crime scene. The genealogists then began eliminating candidates. They could rule out women, since the DNA was male. They could rule out anyone who could be shown to have been living far from New Hampshire in 1981. They could rule out anyone who was too young or too old to fit the likely age profile of the offender. Through this process, they narrowed the field down to a manageable number of candidates, and one name kept appearing as more and more likely: Ronney James Lee. He was the right age, had lived in the right place at the right time, and had a criminal history that fit the profile. But being a likely candidate wasn't enough. The genealogist's work had pointed investigators toward Lee, but they needed definitive proof. That's where Lee's autopsy blood card came in. By extracting DNA from that blood card and comparing it to the crime scene DNA, investigators could definitively confirm whether Lee was the killer. When the results came back showing a match, the case was solved. The genetic genealogy had led them to the right person, and the direct DNA comparison had confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. The future of forensic genetic genealogy. Laura Kempton's case is one of hundreds that have been solved using forensic genetic genealogy since the technique was pioneered in 2018. As databases grow and techniques improve, more cases will be solved. Cold cases that have languished for decades, that seemed hopeless, that families had given up hope of ever seeing resolved, many of these will eventually be solved. This represents an unprecedented opportunity for justice. There are tens of thousands of unsolved homicides in the United States, many of them decades old. Evidence from many of these cases has been preserved and includes DNA. With genetic genealogy, any case with good DNA evidence and where the perpetrator's relatives might be in genealogy databases is potentially solvable. But this also raises questions. As databases grow and techniques improve, we're moving toward a future where it may be nearly impossible to commit a violent crime and escape identification, at least in cases where DNA is left behind. Is that a good thing? Most people would probably say yes. A world where violent criminals can't escape justice is a safer world. But it also means a world where genetic surveillance is increasingly pervasive, where your relative's decision to take an ancestry test could expose you even if you've never submitted your own DNA anywhere. These are complex questions without simple answers. What seems clear is that genetic genealogy is here to stay, that it will continue to solve cold cases, and that society will continue to grapple with the ethical and privacy implications of this powerful technology. Part 9. The Other Case. Tammy Little, the Unsolved Question. Throughout the investigation into Laura Kempton's murder, and particularly after Ronney James Lee was identified as her killer, one question loomed large. What about Tammy Little? Tammy Little, 20 years old, was found murdered in her apartment at 315 Maplewood Avenue in Portsmouth on October 19, 1982, just over a year after Laura's murder. Like Laura, Tammy was a student at Portsmouth Beauty School. Like Laura, she lived in a first-floor apartment. Like Laura, she died from massive head injuries. The similarities were impossible to ignore. For decades, many in Portsmouth believed the same person had killed both women. The timing, the victim profile, the method, it all seemed to point toward a serial killer targeting beauty school students. When Lee was identified as Laura's killer in 2023, many people assumed the Tammy Little case would be solved at the same time. But at the July 20th, 2023 press conference, Attorney General Formella made clear that wasn't the case. That case remains under investigation, he said, when asked about Tammy Little. He expressed hope that the announcement about Laura's case might generate new tips or information about Tammy's murder, but he stopped short of saying Lee was responsible for it. This is frustrating, but not surprising. Just because Lee killed Laura doesn't mean he killed Tammy, even though the cases share surface similarities. Without physical evidence connecting Lee to Tammy's crime scene, without witnesses placing him there, without some definitive proof, investigators can't and shouldn't declare her case solved. There are several possible explanations for why Lee hasn't been definitively linked to Tammy's murder. He didn't do it. The simplest explanation is that Lee killed Laura, but someone else killed Tammy. The similarities between the cases could be coincidental or could be the result of a copycat who read about Laura's murder and recreated it. This would mean Portsmouth suffered two similar but unrelated tragedies in the span of 13 months. Unlikely, but not impossible. Evidence is insufficient. It's possible Lee did kill Tammy, but there isn't enough evidence to definitively prove it. Maybe DNA wasn't successfully collected from Tammy's crime scene, or maybe it was degraded and can't be analyzed. Without DNA evidence to compare against Lee's profile, investigators would have to rely on circumstantial evidence, and that might not be enough to declare the case solved. Investigation is ongoing. It's possible investigators have evidence that Lee killed Tammy, but are still working to confirm it. They may have DNA that they're analyzing, or they may be building a circumstantial case. If so, they wouldn't want to announce conclusions prematurely. Better to wait until they're certain than to declare the case solved and then have to walk it back. What we know about Tammy's case. Public information about Tammy Little's murder is more limited than information about Laura's case, partly because Laura's case has been officially solved and closed while Tammy's remains open. But we know the basic facts. Tammy was found dead in her apartment on the evening of October 19, 1982. Like Laura, she had been killed in her own home. Like Laura, she died from massive head trauma. The specific details of her injuries, the crime scene, and any physical evidence collected haven't been made public, which is standard practice for unsolved cases. Tammy, like Laura, was described as a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was pursuing the same dream Laura had been pursuing: to become a hairdresser, to build a career helping people feel good about themselves. The fact that both victims were beauty school students fueled speculation about a connection, about someone targeting these particular women for their profession or their attendance at this particular school. But connections like that can be misleading. Portsmouth is a small city. The Portsmouth Beauty School was likely one of the main places to study hairdressing in the area. The fact that both victims attended the same school might be coincidence rather than causation. The impact of uncertainty. For Tammy Little's family, the resolution of Laura Kempton's case must have been bittersweet. On one hand, seeing justice finally served in a similar case must have given them hope that Tammy's case might be next. On the other hand, learning that Lee has been identified as Laura's killer but not definitively linked to Tammy's murder must have been deeply frustrating. They're still waiting, still hoping, still living with the not knowing that makes cold cases so particularly painful for families. Every time there's an announcement about advances in forensic science or the solving of another cold case, it must reopen the wound, make them wonder if this will finally be the year their questions get answered. This is one of the hidden tolls of violent crime. For every resolved case like Laura's, there are many more that remain unsolved. For every family that finally gets closure, there are many more still waiting. The advances in forensic science that solved Laura's case after 42 years give hope to these families, but hope can be painful when it's repeatedly deferred. Could genetic genealogy solve Tammy's case? If Tammy Little's murder remains unsolved, could genetic genealogy crack that case too? The answer is maybe, if certain conditions are met. First, there would need to be DNA evidence from Tammy's crime scene. If biological material from the killer was collected and preserved, and if it's in good enough condition to be analyzed, then yes, genetic genealogy could potentially identify the killer the same way it identified Lee in Laura's case. Second, the killer would need to have relatives in genealogy databases. This becomes more likely as time passes and more people take ancestry tests, but it's not guaranteed. If the killer's family simply hasn't participated in ancestry testing, genetic genealogy might not work. Third, funding and resources would need to be available. Genetic genealogy analysis is expensive, and police departments have to prioritize how they allocate limited resources. Portsmouth and the New Hampshire Attorney General's office have shown they're willing to invest in this technology for cold cases, which is encouraging for Tammy's case. If all these factors align, Tammy Little's case could be next in line for the genetic genealogy treatment. Her family and the Portsmouth community can hope that advances in technology will eventually bring the same closure to her case that they brought to Laura's. A warning and a promise. At the press conference announcing the resolution of Laura's case, Attorney General Formella made comments that seemed directed at whoever killed Tammy Little, if it wasn't Lee. His message was clear. We're never going to stop looking for you. We're never going to stop coming for you. This isn't just rhetoric. The successful use of genetic genealogy in Laura's case sends a message to anyone who committed a violent crime years or decades ago and thinks they've gotten away with it. Time is no longer on your side. Evidence that couldn't identify you in 1982 or 1992 or 2002 might be able to identify you today or tomorrow. The case might be cold, but it's not closed. It's not forgotten. And justice, while delayed, is still possible. For Tammy Little's killer, if they're still alive, this should be a wake-up call. The same technology that identified Lee could identify them. The same determination that wouldn't let Laura's case die won't let Tammy's case die either. The clock is ticking. For Tammy's family, Formella's words represented both hope and a renewed commitment from law enforcement. After 41 years of waiting, they have reason to believe that their wait might eventually end, that the same miracle of science and determination that solved Laura's case might solve Tammy's too. Part 10. Reflections and Implications. What Laura's case teaches us. The resolution of Laura Kempton's case, coming 42 years after her murder, offers several important lessons for law enforcement, for families of victims, and for society as a whole. The importance of evidence preservation. The investigators who worked Laura's case in 1981 couldn't have known that DNA technology would eventually solve the case, but they had the foresight to properly collect and preserve biological evidence, even though they had no way to use it effectively at the time. That evidence, carefully maintained for more than 4 decades, ultimately identified Laura's killer. This underscores the critical importance of thorough evidence collection and preservation, even when the immediate utility of that evidence isn't clear. Persistence matters. The Portsmouth Police Department never gave up on Laura's case. Even as leads dried up and years turned into decades, someone was always responsible for maintaining the file, reviewing it periodically, and being ready to pursue new investigative avenues as they became available. When genetic genealogy emerged as a viable option, Portsmouth PD was ready to use it. This persistence, this refusal to let cases go truly cold, is what eventually brings justice. Technology evolves. In 1981, DNA profiling didn't exist. In 2003, DNA profiling existed, but genetic genealogy didn't. In 2018, genetic genealogy became viable for criminal investigations. Who knows what technologies might exist in another 10 or 20 years? Cases that seem unsolvable today might be routinely solvable tomorrow. This should give hope to families waiting for answers and should give pause to criminals who think time will protect them. Justice delayed is still justice. Lee died in 2005, 18 years before being identified as Laura's killer. He never faced arrest, never stood trial, never served time for Laura's murder. In that sense, he escaped earthly justice, but his identification brings a form of justice nonetheless. His name is now forever linked to this terrible crime. Laura's family knows who killed her. The community knows, history knows. Lee's reputation, such as it was, is permanently tarnished. That's not the same as a conviction, but it's not nothing either. The human cost. Numbers and statistics can make us forget the human stories behind criminal cases. So let's be clear about the human cost of Ronney James Lee's actions. Laura Kempton died at 23 years old. She never became the hairdresser she was training to be. She never fell in love, never got married, never had children. She never saw her 30th birthday, or her 40th, or got to grow old. She never had the chance to travel, to pursue hobbies, to make mistakes and learn from them, to experience all the joys and sorrows and mundane moments that make up a full human life. All of that was taken from her in an act of brutal violence. Laura's family has spent 42 years living with her absence. Her parents, if they're still alive, had to bury their daughter and then live with unanswered questions for more than 4 decades. They missed her at holidays and birthdays. They wondered about what she might have become. They lived with the knowledge that her killer was out there somewhere, unknown and unpunished. That's a particular kind of torture that most people can't imagine. Laura's friends lost someone who made them laugh, who brightened rooms, who was supposed to be at their weddings and baby showers, who should have been part of their lives for decades. The Portsmouth community lost a vibrant young member and gained a shadow of fear and uncertainty. And for what? So that Ronney James Lee could satisfy some twisted impulse, could exert power over someone weaker, could commit an act of violence that served no purpose except his own gratification. There's no greater good served by Laura's death, no silver lining to find. No meaning to extract. It was senseless violence, period. Cold cases in America. Laura Kempton's case is just one of tens of thousands of unsolved homicides in the United States. The FBI estimates that as of 2020, there were approximately 250,000 unsolved murders in the country, dating back decades. Behind each of those statistics is a human story like Laura's, a life cut short, a family left with questions, a community impacted by unsolved violence. Cold case investigations are resource-intensive. They require dedicated detectives who are willing to spend countless hours reviewing old files, pursuing new leads, and waiting for breaks that might never come. They require labs that can process old evidence using new technologies. They require funding, which is always limited and has to be allocated among competing priorities. But Laura's case demonstrates why cold case work matters. It shows that these cases can be solved, that justice is still possible even decades later, that the families waiting for answers might eventually get them. Every cold case solved sends a message. We haven't forgotten, we're still looking, we won't give up. The advent of genetic genealogy has reinvigorated cold case investigations across the country. Cases that had seemed hopeless are being solved. Families that had given up hope are getting closure. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder are being identified. This is changing the landscape of criminal investigation in fundamental ways. Privacy versus justice. The use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations raises difficult questions about the balance between individual privacy rights and society's interest in solving serious violent crimes. There's no easy answer, but it's a conversation worth having. On the privacy side, people who submit their DNA to ancestry companies do so to learn about their heritage and find relatives, not to help police solve crimes. Using those databases for law enforcement purposes without explicit consent feels like a violation of privacy to many people. Moreover, genetic genealogy can identify people who've never submitted their own DNA anywhere. If enough of your relatives have taken ancestry tests, you can potentially be identified, even if you've been careful to avoid providing DNA yourself. This raises questions about genetic privacy and whether we have a right to keep our genetic information private. On the justice side, violent crimes tear communities apart, traumatize victims and their families, and undermine our collective sense of safety. When someone murders another person, they forfeit certain moral claims to privacy. If using genealogy databases can identify murderers and rapists, doesn't society have an interest in doing so? And aren't the people who voluntarily upload their DNA to public databases implicitly accepting that their information might be used for purposes beyond just finding relatives? Both perspectives have merit. The solution might lie in making the choice explicit, allowing people to opt in or opt out of law enforcement use of their genetic data, as GED Match now does. This respects individual autonomy while still allowing those who want to help solve crimes to make their information available. What seems clear is that genetic genealogy isn't going away. The technology exists, it works, and it's solving cases. The question isn't whether it will be used, but how it will be regulated, and what safeguards will be put in place to protect privacy while still allowing criminal investigations to proceed. Looking forward. As of 2023, Laura Kempton's case is closed. Ronney James Lee has been identified as her killer, and while he never faced justice in a courtroom, his identification brings a form of closure. The case stands as an example of how far forensic science has come and how persistence in investigation can eventually pay off. But the work continues. Tammy Little's case remains unsolved, as do roughly 130 other cold cases in New Hampshire alone. Across the country, families are still waiting, still hoping, still wondering if this will be the year they finally get answers. Law enforcement agencies are increasingly embracing genetic genealogy and other advanced forensic techniques. More officers are being trained in these methods. More funding is being allocated to cold case units. More evidence from old cases is being reanalyzed using modern techniques. This gives hope. Hope that other families will get the closure that Laura's family received. Hope that other communities will see justice served, even if delayed. Hope that the shadow of unsolved violence can eventually be lifted. For Laura's family, the resolution of the case marks the end of one phase of grief and the beginning of another. They finally know who killed Laura and why. They can stop wondering and start truly processing. It doesn't bring Laura back. It doesn't erase 42 years of absence, but it provides something they've been without for more than 4 decades. Answers. A final word on Laura. In all the discussion of DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and criminal investigation techniques, it would be easy to lose sight of the person at the heart of this story. So let's end by remembering Laura Kempton not as a case number or a murder victim, but as a person. Laura was 23 years old when she died. She was described by everyone who knew her as an outgoing free spirit with a big personality and a love for new wave fashion. She was pursuing her dream of becoming a hairdresser, working jobs to support herself while going to school, building a life in Portsmouth. She had friends who loved her. She had family who adored her. She had dreams and plans and a future that should have stretched out for decades. She was a person, a full, complex, interesting person, not just a victim. What happened to Laura was a tragedy. But Laura herself was not a tragedy. She was a young woman living her life, pursuing her dreams, being herself in all her colorful, free-spirited glory. That's what was taken from the world when Ronney James Lee killed her. Not just a life, but a personality, a presence, a person who made the world around her brighter. The resolution of Laura's case doesn't bring her back. Nothing can do that. But it ensures that her story has an ending, that she's not lost to history as just another unsolved case, that she's remembered not just for how she died, but for how she lived. Rest in peace, Laura Kempton. After 42 years, you can finally rest. Epilogue, the press conference and family statement. On that July day in 2023, as Attorney General Formella and Chief Newport stood before cameras and reporters at Portsmouth City Hall, they were speaking not just to the media, but to history. They were closing a chapter that had been open for 42 years. They were honoring a promise made in 1981 to a young woman who'd been failed by the limits of technology at the time, but who was finally being served by the persistence of investigators and the power of modern science. The family statement, read by a representative, captured the complex emotions of the moment. The Kempton family wishes to express our deepest gratitude to the Portsmouth Police Department for solving Laura's case. Their diligence and determination, along with extraordinary personal commitment over the past decades, have led to this moment for Laura. We would like to acknowledge retired Captain John Paraki, Portsmouth Police Department Investigative Division, and his team members, past and present, who have worked tirelessly on Laura's case. Many, many other hands have touched Laura's file over the past 41 years, and the family expresses our deepest gratitude to all who contributed. Those words, this moment for Laura, are particularly poignant. After 42 years, Laura finally had her moment. Not the moment she deserved, not the moment she should have had when she was 23 and full of life and possibility, but a moment nonetheless, a moment when truth came to light, when questions got answers, when justice, delayed by more than 4 decades, finally arrived. In the audience at that press conference were investigators who'd worked the case, community members who remembered Laura, journalists there to tell the story to the world. And somewhere, though we don't know exactly where, were members of Laura's family, finally receiving the answers they'd waited so long to hear. The press conference lasted about 30 minutes. Questions were asked and answered. Details were provided. The story was told. And then it was over, and everyone went back to their lives, changed in small or large ways by what they'd just witnessed. For Laura's family, the journey continues. Grief doesn't end just because questions get answered, but they can move forward now with a completeness they didn't have before. They know. After 42 years of not knowing, they finally know. And for Ronney James Lee, dead for 18 years before being identified as Laura's killer, his name is now forever linked to this crime. He escaped earthly justice, but he didn't escape history. He will be remembered, if he's remembered at all, as the man who killed Laura Kempton. That's his legacy, such as it is. The case is closed. The file is marked solved. Laura can rest. And somewhere in Portsmouth, in evidence rooms and on memorial pages and in the memories of those who loved her, Laura Kempton's story endures, not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, whose life had value, whose death demanded justice. Justice came late, but it came. If you or someone you know has information about an unsolved crime, please contact your local law enforcement agency or the anonymous tip line in your area. Cold cases can be solved, but they need community involvement and support. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to this channel. There are thousands of cold cases still waiting to be solved, thousands of families still waiting for answers. By staying informed and engaged, we can all play a small role in ensuring that no victim is forgotten and that justice, however delayed, remains possible. Thank you for listening to Laura's story. May she rest in peace, and may her case inspire hope for all those still waiting for answers.